Hey, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining today. Welcome to the third session of our series on Israel-Iran relations. Today, we're fortunate to have with us Dr. Arash Azizi, who will discuss the Israel debate in Iranian politics between 1947 to 1979. Dr. Azizi is a visiting fellow at Boston University Center for the Study of the Longer Range Future. His work focuses on the Cold War and the Global South, particularly the Middle East. And he's also the author of two recent books, The Shadow Commander, Soleimani, the US, and Iran's Global Ambitions, and more recently, What Iranians Want, Women, Life, and Freedom. I just want to remind everyone to use the Q&A function for questions. And with that, you have the Zoom floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kant. It's an honor to be here. I'm very glad to be here. I wish I could be there in person. I was, supposed to be there in person at some point, and I hope we can make it again happen at some point. But it's nevertheless great to be here. Slightly awed by the list of some of the people attending, some of the scholars whose work I respect a lot and I've sort of used in my own. So it's great to have this group here today. So what I want to talk about today is the contours of what I call the Israel debate in Iranian politics. And uh, I won't use a PowerPoint today, by the way. I sort of decided that virtually, it's better to not to use this format. But if there were, if there were some pictures and stuff, I can sort of show them at some point. But I thought it's better to engage in this format. Um, so what do I mean by Israel debate in Iranian politics? The question is sometimes posed as sort of the Palestine question. In my own work, I've used this term, sort of Palestine question in Iranian politics and the moment of 1947, 1948, when there's a question of, what is going to happen to the British Mandate of Palestine, actually in the years leading to 1947 also. But the Israel debate for me has it's obviously a very related question, but has to do with how different factions of the Iranian politics, both in the state and in different sections of societally and intellectually and politically, are coming to the question of Israel, of the coming to life of the Jewish state of Israel in 1948, and of how to deal with it in the years that will come later. The most obvious question being what sort of should be Iran's relation with it, both societally and sort of politically and diplomatically. And this very way of posing the question, I think, already will tell you something about my orientation and sort of also my intervention. Because usually when we speak about Iranian-Israeli relations, we sort of forget that the Iranian side has a very important sort of politics to this. Um, the narratives usually like to talk about, for example, oh, well, Israel and Iran were friends before 1979, and then they break this friendship after 79, which sort of, I mean, obviously true, is a sort of tourism as a starting point, but it's important, I think, to see what did this friendship really mean, and also how did the Iranian politics um, and react to it and relate to it. And I think this is also important because Iran, this is going to be a rather Iran-centric talk, if you will, in some ways. And that's again not accidental, because I think Iran, is quite a, it's sort of has quite its own unique politics, obviously, like any other major country, and that's again sometimes forgotten. That for Iranians, when Iranians, I think it can be often forgotten, whether today actually or before. And I purposely kept the talk to 1979. We barely have time for that actually, but I think it should be clear that I think a lot of this talk has very clear implications for today. That Iran in 1979 did not suddenly turn into a different country. I mean, obviously, there was a revolution and very important change in the state policy, but Iran has remained Iran. And I think that's also a fact that sometimes it's forgotten, or sometimes we act like this is what has happened, right? But there are serious continuities, and I'm very happy to give another talk at some point. And my research sort of goes throughout this period now from 1979 to now, and what has happened to Israel debate in Iranian politics since then. Um, Now, so when we look at some of the very common analysis of Iranian-Israeli relations in this period, it's sort of remarkable how often they are sort of externalized, i.e., external factors are always taken into account. So if you ask, if you try to, download a couple of papers to read about this, you're very likely, what are some of the themes you're very likely to hear? You're very likely to hear of David Ben-Gurion's policy of the periphery, that okay, Israel in its early years wanted to have relations with neighbors of its neighbors, so Iran, Turkey, Ethiopia. These are non-Arab countries of the Middle East, sort of states around the Arab world. Israel wanted to have relations with them in order to sort of overcome its isolation in the Arab world. Well, great from an Israeli strategic perspective, but as another talk I had on this topic was titled "Nobody's Periphery," because well, Iran didn't see itself as like a neighbor of Israel. Israel was a rather a small country that existed in sort of Iran's immediate neighborhood. So obviously, from the Iranian perspective, this couldn't explain from Iranian perspective why does Iran early on decide to have relations with Israel, and again, what are sort of some of the debates happening around this. The other is sort of a very basic U.S. Cold War lens. As some of you might know my work, I never saw a Cold War analysis I didn't like. I know I'm all about the Cold War, but it doesn't matter how one does it. And I will talk about the United States at some point during this talk, but this cannot be and seen, and it's a basic empirical question, by the way. For me, it's not like if it was the fact the United States had forced Iran to take certain positions in Israel and the record showed that, I'd be very happy to admit it. It's not just like my vain patriotism to say that's not the case, but the record really does not show that to us, Rod. If you look at all the debates about Israel in Iran, and there's tons of them, as I'll show to you today, and I'll take you through some tour of some debates on Israel in Iranian politics on all sides throughout all these few decades. United States is not often it's not even mentioned, and when it's mentioned, it's not necessarily mentioned as a very main factor. In fact, Soviet Union is as likely to be mentioned, which that's an interesting Cold War angle of its own. But at any rate, this is not a basic to put it more straight. In no way is this a case of the U.S. told Iran to have relations with Israel, and the Shah, of course, was the goon of the imperialists, so he had to do it. I mean, that's not what we will see when we look at the question closely. And by the way, the historiography, to the degree that it exists in the Islamic Republic, also does this. I have to say that the historiography in the Islamic Republic has become more sophisticated over the years, but there's a lot of accounts you can see that it basically says, well, of course, Shah was the US's lackey, so that's why he had sort of relations with Zionists and Israel and all that. But if you look at a lot of more recent historiography, this has also become more complicated there. But when you're writing literature review and stuff, there's a good few crude sort of accounts that gives a good reason to sort of criticize before you get to your own account. But I do want to acknowledge that historiography there has gotten more complicated. Okay, so let me start. Even though the talk says 1947, I'd like to have a bit of a prehistory. In 1947, of course, there was no Israel yet. That would come a year later. But let me also take it a little back to 1930s and give you a bit of a prehistory of Iranian approach to this question before there was Israel, and before I can get to 1947. So in 1930s, actually already, like we can say 1929, which some see as a sort of beginning of Jewish Arab conflict or sort of the roots of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Um, uh, so already by 1929, 1930s, what's happening in Iran at the time, of course. So Reza Shah, the founder of the Pahlavi dynasty, is fairly in charge. And this is an important sort of introduction, scene setting for me, if you will. It would be, we would do well to remember, yes, Reza Shah is the head of a state, but the Iranian state exists, and it has a somewhat impressive apparatus with the standards of the time, right? Iran, I want to remind ourselves, is a founding member of the League of Nations, pretty unique for a country in this sort of non-Western world to have that position. It's the only the only Muslim country to be a founding member of the League of Nations. It has serious diplomats who are making policy. And when you want to write about this period, it has very important statesmen like Muhammad Ali Furughi, who's a household name in today's Iran, and I think some sort of a national hero for many. Some might have a more critical lens. At any rate, he is this grand statesman, and he is at some point he's actually the head of the assembly at sort of the equivalent to today's United Nations General Assembly, basically at the League of Nations. So he had this important, prominent international role, and these are some of the people making Iranian policy at the time. And in the 1930s, Iran also has a consulate in Jerusalem. This consulate basically mostly takes care of um, it has an important political function. Its roots goes back to the Ottoman Empire, um, but it mostly takes care of a lot of important sort of business. Obviously, there are Iranian nationals who are passing through, who have business or merchants. Right, Jerusalem it's a fairly important corner of the region, so Iran sort of has that sort of presence there. But in the 1930s, we can already see the roots of the Iranian approach. And I'm going to be provocative and say, I was born in 1988. So the Iranian approach that I know and my generation knows is obviously one of saying, well, Israel is a cancerous tumor, as Ayatollah Khomeini said, and it should be destroyed, and this kind of policy. But if you look at it longue durée, and may I dare, as I say, boldly suggest that if you look at it from the perspective in 50 years or not, um, if I may indulge in a bit of futurology, um, the the dominant Iranian approach actually is going to be something else rooted sort of in Iranian national identity and national interest. And you can already see this in the 1930s. And what is this careful policy that Furughi adopts? And yeah, so Furughi is prime minister at some point, really the most important person setting the Iranian foreign policy at some point. Of course, Reza Shah has the final decision, but he doesn't seem to have been minutely sort of interested in a lot of this stuff. So Furughi has an important role in setting it. His policy is that, look, Iran is a Muslim country, it's a Muslim majority country. It should have sympathy with the Palestinian Muslims. Um, and, the Jewish migrants who are coming in the 1930s, a lot of them are coming from Europe. Obviously, most of them are coming from Europe. So uh, Furughi's approach to the question is that of solidarity, if you will, with the Palestinian Muslims, the Arab Muslims at the time, who are obviously protesting against this migration. So he definitely has those sympathies. But what is very important is that he understands that, look, he says, first of all, Iran should not be, to put it very sort of directly, an enemy of the Jews, right? That Iran can have sympathies with the Palestinian Muslims here, but it should not be a party to this conflict on one side, for sure, and it should not join, if you will, this anti-Jewish wagon. And one basic reason for this is that Iran itself has obviously a lot of Jewish citizens, but also Iran sees itself, frankly, and this is what I'm trying to explain in this piece. Iran sees itself to be bigger than this, frankly, right? Iran sees itself as a bigger sort of civilizational unit with a very long history. Um, its view on this conflict is going to be, a bit like it would view a conflict in the Horn of Africa or somewhere else in the region as something that is important, that is regionally important, that's going to affect Iran. But Iran should not sort of stoop as to just support one side in this conflict just because it shares sort of a religion with them. In 1929, actually, Furughi is the president of the General Assembly, so he has to take positions on the sort of events of 1929 in the British Mandate of Palestine. And then his positions are very sort of diplomatic and neutral. I don't want to spend too much time in the prehistory, but what he explains it very clearly, actually, to the Iranian constituents at the time, which basically says it's very important in our policy, and I'm translating here direct quote. I'm going to read some good direct quotes as a good sort of political historian here. I think it's a lot of fun. He says, Iran should not attract the suspicion of two strong elements in the world, that is the British government and the Jewish people, Qawm Yahud, if you're, for the Persian speakers, to the Iranian state and nation. And that's going to be a core of the Iranian approach. And he says, as someone representing an Islamic country, Mamlakat Islami, I will feel I will feel sympathy for Muslims in Palestine, but I also feel sympathy, and this is very important, for other catastrophes in the world of humanity, and I hope they don't take place again. It's very important. Basically, it says we're very sorry, but this is not going to be something that we're gonna take a very direct sides in. And there's a very fascinating period here. So he gives an interview to Journal du Genève, um, which he believes later on he corresponds with Journal de Genève, which obviously League of Nations was based in Geneva, right? And so Fourouk is in Geneva. And in this interview, they reflect his words as sort of neutrality, but he corresponds with the journal later and he says, look, um, you should reflect my position in the whole, which I expressed some worries about um, the situation. I asked for calm. I was both sided. You're making me to appear too one sided, as if I have no sympathies for Muslims. So he was very sensitive as to how Iran would come neutrally here. There's also a very fascinating period of he working with an Islamic journal that is coming out in Geneva at the time, Eastern Tribune. And it's he basically says to them, he says, hey, you guys are Muslim, you're pan-Muslim activists, right? This is a period in which Muslim nation states are yet to be formed. And he says, look, you need to be a bit more active about this if you want to counter, the Zionist movement is doing all this work in Europe. If you want to be a smart, you got to go work in the European politics. And, this is how you do it. Obviously, I am a representative of Iran. I can't do it. We'll be happy to consult with you, but these are some things you can do. And then when they don't do it and the sort of the activities of them is not very sophisticated, he has this very interesting line in which he says, look, yeah, you guys are this is why Jews are always going to win over you, basically, because you're not sophisticated, you don't know how to do this kind of work. So these are some of the interesting periods there. Bagher Kazemi, who's the Iranian diplomat in 1935, speaks more directly in support of Palestinian Arabs in the League of Nations. He gets a sort of thank you letter from the Grand Mufti. The Grand Mufti, of course, at this period is organizing this Islamic Congress in Jerusalem, which Iran does send representatives to. It has some supporters in Iran. There's some pan-Islamic mobilization at this point, which does have its supporters in Iran. So that's sort of one side of the coin. Um, but at the very same period, this let's call it the Cyrusism in relation to Israeli politics in Iran. This also is an element that exists. There's an element in Iran. So I talked about basically the state policy, which is careful, diplomatic, after Iranian national interest, and basically neutralist, if you will. Then I talked about there are Muslim sympathies and sort of pan-Islamic sympathies on one side, but there are also sympathies to the Zionist movement and to what is considered to sort of be the global Jewish people from an Iranian perspective, which likes to couch this very much in the story of Cyrus the Great. I think everyone here knows the story, so I'm not going to repeat it. Cyrus the Great freed the Jews from the Babylonian captivity. We have this global links. This is not just something that now, Reza Pahlavi came up with. This is something that is said throughout history of Iran. And if you look at Ayatollah Sami'i, who is foreign minister of Reza Shah from 1936 to 1938, he is one who uses that language. Anyways, slightly coming forward in my narration, we get to the Second World War. In the Second World War, which is an area of research that I'm very enthusiastic about, and there's some really great work happening on it. Folks like Jennifer Jenkins, Mohammad Tawakkoli, Lior Stenfeld, Shushan Shahabi, they've all done sort of fascinating work that relates to that period, and some more that is coming out. In the period of the Second World War, Iran becomes pretty important, I would argue, to the Zionist movement and to sort of the global Jewish diaspora in some ways. Iran is the most important non-combatant theater of Second World War, as Jennifer Jenkins has argued. It is a place in which the big three first meet for the first time. That's Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Iran becomes what is called the bridge of victory. It's going to have a very important role in the Second World War, but it's also a place in which it's also a place of Holocaust survival. Those of you who follow our work at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, we've developed a lot of material to talk about that. There are hundreds of mostly Polish Jews who spend the years of the Holocaust in Iran. Basically, they either pass through the country, and a lot of them end up in the British Mandate of Palestine, what becomes later Israel. They're known as Tehran children. Michal Dekel's book about her own father is also sort of a study of this phenomenon of Tehran children that some of you might know about. And so the Iran starts to have an official relationship with the Zionist movement in this period. The Jewish Agency opens a Palestine office in Iran. It's called the Palestine office in 1942. That's what later becomes basically first Israeli embassy in Iran, Israeli unofficial embassy, because Iran and Israel never have official diplomatic relationship. And also Zionist pioneers, usually categorized under Halutz, start doing some degree of sort of activity in Iran. Not so much, the end result of it is not so much Iranian Jews moving to Palestine and later Israel, but both to help Iraqi Jews make that transition, and also the sort of European Jews that were passing to Iran or staying in Iran. There's this new good book by Ali Levi Ezzatyar about Iranian immigration to Israel that I'm reviewing right now that has very fascinating work on this period also. So during the 1942, as I said, this is a very fascinating period. I hope to write more about it. Some of the leading lights of the Zionist movement, if you will, are passing some good time in Tehran. Moshe, well, I shouldn't introduce her as Moshe Sharet's wife, but that's what she would be known to most people who follow Israeli history superficially, perhaps. But Zipporah Sharet is a very sort of important activist in her own right, an important Zionist feminist activist, and she is in Iran for a good period. In this period, for a significant time in this period, and this obviously makes the sort of Israel debate in Iran much more active and much more relevant to the developments in the country. Now, comes 1947, I'd like to shift back to the sort of state policy. You will see that I'll move between state and politics and society throughout this talk. So in 1947, Iran is once more, we are an important country, founding member of the United Nations now, part of the United Nations, a victor country in the war. I think most even Iranian historians like to tell this history of Anglo-Soviet invasion of 1941, and Iran is the sort of a victim of this invasion. I like to suggest a slight, revisionist take in this history. Yes, Iran was invaded by England and Soviet Union in 1941, but these are also the countries that guarantee Iran's sovereignty and Iran's government. Yes, after it went through this change, but nevertheless, it is Iran's government that joins the Allied, declares war on Nazi Germany. So it's a victor country of the Second World War. And there is a very important, it would also do us well to remember, of course, that the Second World War was won by a global alliance between the communist movement and the capitalist countries. Soviet Union obviously had the sort of primary role in defeating Nazi Germany, and the Iranian communists, which is a very significant movement. There was a Communist Party of Persia in 1930s when Iran was still called Persia, in sort of external as an exonym. But the Tudeh Party of Iran, on the ashes of the Communist Party, which was destroyed, with the joint work of Stalin and Reza Shah, mostly Stalin actually. But so the Tudeh Party of Iran is founded in 1941. It really defends the war effort, and is very happy to call Iran a bridge of victory, as do sort of these railway workers in Iran who are building, who have built the actual railways that helped. It's a literal bridge of victory that helps the United States and Allied give help to Soviet Union in the war. At any rate, so Iran as a victor nation of the Second World War is in a strong position to help set the world order. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit. Of course, Iran is not on the level of even, let's say, China or sitting at the big table, but nevertheless, it definitely sees itself on that level, and it does have some important role in post-war, in building the post-war order. I think it's often goes unacknowledged. So Nasrullah Entezam is this Iranian diplomat at the United Nations at the time. So he relates to the question of what is at the time called the question of Palestine in a few ways. So first of all, Entezam is part of the team that UN sends to Palestine, to British Mandate of Palestine in December 47. So this is after they have passed the resolution that decides to partition the place. But Entezam has also gone there before, and it's interesting that his presence there. The Arabs, if you will, sort of look at it kind of positively because they see Iran as a fellow Muslim country, and his speeches definitely are can be, quite critical. And as you will see, the position in Iran will take is against the partition. But it's also quite interesting that um, he is talking in Persian to people around him. Ali Ghori Ardalan, this other Iranian diplomat that is with him, and in his speeches, in this little side talk, he keeps sort of praising the sort of Zionist institutions. He's very impressed with the Moshavim and with the kibbutz, and they all look at what they're doing, and they're doing all this work in the desert. Of course, he thinks he's speaking in Persian, so no one else is gonna catch it. But Israelis happen to have Persian speakers there who are there and sort of not quite as spies, but I mean they're not saying anything about understanding Persian, but they're catching all of this. So that's how we know about it because the Israeli sources later report that actually, look, Entezam, we should this should give us some hope about Iran because Entezam, even though he has his public position, he's kind of impressed by the Zionist movement. Um, and we know the basic UN story. Iran, together with India and Yugoslavia, suggests the plan for, if you will, it's a one-state solution from the standards of the time. It's sort of a federal solution with Jerusalem to be an international zone and to be a Jewish and Arab zone inside a sort of single state. That doesn't get passed, of course, with the support of the West, Soviet Union, Latin American countries. The partition is what gets passed. Israel is formed in 1948. And Iran, in the first few years, votes reliably against Israel, if you will, on all the important questions. It votes against the admission of Israel into the United Nations. It votes against. So I mean, I just mentioned it votes against the partition resolution. There's a General Assembly resolution for making Jerusalem into sort of corpus separatum. Iran votes for it alongside the Arab countries. Israel votes against it. Nevertheless, so this is the state level. I want to go back again to politics. What is happening in Iranian politics at the time? What are some of the approaches to Israel? To just, if you will, we can already now talk about it. It's not clear that it's going to be called Israel, but what is going to be, the forming Jewish state. It's very clear by late 1947 that there's going to be a Jewish state here. It's not clear that it's called Israel. But anyway, I keep saying it's important. It's not clear that to be called Israel because this makes research about it more fun and sort of harder sometimes because people are not going to use the term like the Israeli government. So they use all sorts of things in translation. It can be sort of surprising sometimes all the different terms that people use for it. They will often, for example, say the coming Jewish Palestinian government, something like that. But they mean whatever the Zionist movement ends up building there. So what are some of the sides to the Iranian politics in this? There is a pan-Islamic opposition to a very strong pan-Islamic opposition to this new forming Jewish state. It has its roots, as I said, to pan-Islamic who had some collaboration. If you will, there was a triangle of Muslim Brotherhood, the Mufti in Jerusalem and this Iranian pan-Islamist, the group Fadayan Islam, the Islam's devotees, has formed already. This is a group that engages in sort of assassinations against its opponents, against people that it believes are infidels. Its mentor is Ayatollah Kashani, this very grand figure in Iranian politics at the time, this cleric, who, in the parlance of the time, though, it is important to remember. I'm talking about late 1940s, early 50s. Kashani is seen as right wing and as pro-US a little bit. I mean, not quite pro-US, but let's say definitely anti-communist, right? So there's a very important anti-communism to his mobilization. So just one second. Yeah, sorry. There's a very important anti-communism to his mobilization. So that's the shadow of it. That's sort of the color of it, and we'll get to what it is. So Kashani obviously, and obviously very open anti-Semitism, right? So very open anti-Semitism. Just a few years after the Holocaust, after the defeat of the Nazi Germany, this is what the meaning of anti-Semitism is in 47, 48, right? So you're gonna have a lot of opponents when you are anti-Semitic in 47, 48 in this color in the Iranian politics. because what I would call there's a broad front of, if you will, pro-UN, pro-New World Order politics. All this sort of song and dance I read about Iran having a role in the building of the New World Order. I mean, this is part of the reason, right? Because at the time, there's the understanding that the UN is a good thing. It's, by the way, it's built by both Soviet Union and the United States, and Iran is part of this new world order. And we defeated Nazism and fascism, and those who are opposing this, so both a decision of the UN and propagating this sort of anti-Semitism, are viewed negatively by sort of a broad progressive front. This doesn't last very long, as we will see, like many things in this period. But it's important to remember. I think this period of history is very fascinating, by the way, post 1945 and before the Cold War is in full swing. And I think the specificity of this period is forgotten. Non-historians, I think historians would need no convincing why it's so interesting. Non-historians might say, well, so what? Well, things change in 5 years. Why don't we just study the final form as opposed to these little years of flux? But I think they really matter, and I hope to be able to explain why. So Kashani calls for a demo against the UN partition resolution in the Shah's Mosque in Tehran in January 1948. All hell breaks loose. He publishes a statement in which he says at the time, and I'll quote, I'm going to do a lot of quote as I said throughout. How can Palestine be a homeland for Jewish, German, Russian, and American migrants and the like? Based on what logic and law? If you want to make Zionists pleased with you and use them, do it in your own countries. Forming a Zionist state will become a node of many corruptions for Muslims of the Middle East and perhaps all the world, and it won't only hurt the Arabs of Palestine. Kashani also promises to organize forces. He opens a bank account in the Bank Melli to send, to mobilize and send Iranians to go fight in the war that was already brewing, right? The civil war in the lead up to the formation of the State of Israel in May 1948. All the research that I've done, and it has been plenty, hasn't shown a single Iranian who actually went. So I don't know what happened to all the money he raised, and maybe it was sort of given as charity later on. But I haven't found a single Iranian who actually went um, to fight. But then again, that the Islamic Republic hasn't really been able to dispatch a lot of Iranians to fight there either, even despite having a state. So this might also give you a flavor of the pan-Islamic, anti-Israel mobilization. A lot of times that it's a lot of talk, but sometimes not a lot of action. Other important sort of political element here is that what's the other big partition that has happened here at the time is the partition of India, of course. And Kashani somehow brings these two things together. And there's a very sort of weird anti-Jewish, but also anti-Hindu and anti-Sikh campaign. It kind of wouldn't make sense to say, well, India was a Muslim land that it was cut into or something like that. But at any rate, because partition is after all a conflict it's seen as a conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims, and they're happening at roughly the same time. This is the way in which they intervene here. And Kashani is not alone. There are other elements in Iranian politics at the time, like Hassan Arfa and his newspaper Atash, that run the sort of same things. Atash at some point says, for example, that Iran has become a den for terrorist organization of Haganah, Eastern Gang, and Irgun. They send arms to Palestine from western and southwestern borders of Iran. So there's sort of this sensationalist journalism on the issue. And Kashani at some point interviews Atash and says, we have an organization to fight Jews and Sikhs. That's like Punjabi Sikhs. But we won't talk openly about it now. He didn't need to talk openly. Everyone knew that this is the Fadayan. And it says Jews must be fought sternly. They control the world economy. They have no emotions and spend all their efforts raising money. All their smuggling is done by them. So you see, he engages in some sort of a basic anti-Semitism as part of this mobilization. But as I said, there's a very broad coalition that opposes this. Dr. Kent, you said I have an hour to talk, right? Yes, great. So there's a very broad coalition that opposes this. To the party is obviously very important. Iran's Communist Party is a den of Jewish activism. There's a lot of Jewish people in it. According to Leo Stenfeld's estimates, 25% of some leading bodies of the party are Jewish at some point. If you look at the oral history accounts that folks like Homa Sarshar have gathered, you'll see a lot of sort of colorful, important information about this period of Iranian Jews' role in the communist movement. I would like to say that, like, again, like a lot of other people, including Jewish people around the world who joined the communist parties, it might be that you're Iranian Jew, you join the communist movement for 2 years, and then the rest of your life you have nothing to do with communism. So a lot of people who are like, well, where are all these Jewish communists? We don't know any of our neighborhood. It was a sort of very particular to that period. Many people, of course, many Iranian Jews remain in the communist movement all their lives, but some don't. But at any rate, the Tudeh party has comes to this, which is a sort of important societal force, is the most important political party in Iran at the time. Um, it comes at this in a few ways. First of all, it is pro-partition, as is the Soviet Union. Now, why? This is a major argument of my dissertation that I won't repeat here. The short answer is no, it's not because Stalin told them to. It's because they come to a Marxist analysis that say, yeah, okay, we don't like Zionism, we consider it a nationalist bourgeois ideology. But the Jews who are living in Palestine have a right to self-determination, which means the right to form their own state. It's clear they can't have a state with Arab Palestinians by 1947. It's clear that that's impossible. Um, some of the frustration I have with some of the sort of historiography who opposes that period says, oh, how come they did this? And they've sold their soul to Zionism, or what did they do this? The basic point here is that it's very clear to everybody who is actually serious and you're not trying to write an op-ed 100 years later, is that, well, it's not an actual option. There's no side in the politics of Arab Palestinians, for example, who's saying let's have a common state with Jews at the time. So they basically agree to the partition, which means they agree with the state of Israel's formation, as we will see how this agreement will show itself in a fascinating number of ways. So yes, you could be anti-Zionist and pro-Israel, if you will. And this is a position that we'll see throughout. They oppose nationalism just like they would oppose, let's say, Polish nationalism as a bourgeois ideology, but they believe the state of Israel is there, so Iran should have relations with it, which becomes the sort of relevant thing. And there's also a lot of pro-UN sentiments, as I tried to mention. Like they believe, okay, the United Nations has decided this, we should build this world together, we shouldn't oppose it. And Tudeh party is not alone. Kashani's reactionary anti-Semitic provocations and mobilizations are opposed by many people. For example, the Democratic Party, which is the party of Ahmad Qavam, I would call it the centrist party at the time, he denounces Kashani, and the Democrat Iran, which is the newspaper, and calls it, savage provocations that are done in the name of Islam but actually help the foreigners. He also attacked Ibrahim Hakimi, the prime minister, as being complicit in this. Iran Ema, another newspaper, condemns Kashani as demagogic. Indian embassy in Tehran publishes this statement, which says it's all about Pakistan and Britain who are organizing all of this, which is interesting because the Indian embassy's statement is also published everywhere. Tudeh party, the Communist Party, in an editorial in early 1948 and in its newspaper Name Mardom, runs a very important and well-read editorial against Kashani and them. It says, where does so much worry for Palestine and India come from? It basically says, you guys don't worry about the rights of Iranians and you pretend like you worry for the rights of everybody else. And the Tudeh party press is very important at the time. I would say that, Tudeh party's press in this period is the first Iranian source to offer, well, maybe not first, but it's the most important Iranian source to offer, number one, a very serious reading of Zionist politics that is not about sort of empty sensationalism that you will find even today, actually. And also actually Jewish politics. And the Holocaust is one of the first, Tudeh party started memorializing the Holocaust, if you will, which is very important sort of subject of my work. Now, the word Holocaust is not necessarily used, but let's say, the crimes done in Auschwitz and Dachau, which was very clear that, they're talking about the Holocaust. And specifically, they talk about Jewish people. The crimes done to these people in Auschwitz and Dachau, is like a phrase that is used, right? In relation to the brewing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So they very much see it in that light, which is very unique for that period. The Iranian press at the time has sort of runs I want to get ahead in time, but so runs very sensational coverage. For example, I love the coverage of King David Hotel's bombing in July 1946. Because it's not even negative necessarily. It's just very, for example, Etelaat speaks of mysterious Jewish organization in the world the strange power of Jewish terrorists, who are organizing this thing. So it's like a very, and doesn't really differentiate between, let's say, Irgun and Haganah or Jewish agency, but the Tudeh party does. The Tudeh party, even before, by the way, the famous Gromyko speech. Gromyko is a Soviet foreign minister, gives a speech in May 1947. He says we are for partition. Before that, in April, a month before that, we see the Tudeh party press, who, and I don't have a lot of time to go into the details of this. Um, but for example, it says if the British hadn't deprived Jews of their rights, and if a Jewish state had existed in Palestine, it would have been possible to avoid the massacres of Hitler. So you see a very striking advocacy of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, a Jewish state in Palestine. Actually, they use the term state and linking it to the Second World War and the Holocaust. And if this is even before the Soviet Union changes its position. And it offers a positive view, in fact, of Haganah and frankly even a bit of Irgun and Istangang, because it's sort of talking about it as modern Jewish politics. And it sort of criticizes some Iranian Jewish press as for being a bit conservative. It's like, oh, you keep running things about, how to keep ritually clean on Jewish holidays, whereas these exciting new developments are happening in Palestine by this Jewish politics, and you're ignoring all of this. And they also offer a very interesting Marxist analysis of Tanakh and Hebrew Bible pretty regularly. All right. So, I see the time is passing by, so I have to jump over some of this stuff. So the Tudeh party at the time, also one of the very fascinating figures in this period is Mehdi Hashem Najafi, very fascinating figure. This guy is born and raised in Iraq. He was a high-ranking member of the Iraqi Communist Party. He's from a Shia family, sort of, obviously. He's this very fascinating figure who leaves Iraq. He's basically forced to go to Iran, and from a leading member of Iraqi Communist Party, he becomes a leading member of the Tudeh party of Iran. He is, if you will, the most quote unquote pro-Israel member of the Tudeh party at the time. He actually writes a lot against Arab nationalism, if you will. He keeps talking about colonial and reactionary Arab elites. He debates both some of his comrades back in the Iraqi Communist Party and some of the Iranian communists on this question. Every side in the debate is still sort of accepts the partition, but they're having different relations to 47-48 war. Very fascinating period. I want to give you again the flavors of Iranian sort of political debates at a time, right? These are some of the debates that are happening in the press. Which, by the way, if Stalin just gave a signal to everybody and everybody danced, then why have these lively debates on the pages of the Iranian and Iraqi communist press? So what is the question? What is the position that Tudeh party ends up developing on Israel? The position is basically they want Israel to be an anti-colonial, preferably pro-Soviet and socialist country. And this might be surprising to many people. It won't be surprising to anyone familiar with early Israeli history, right? If there was one country in the world which you had a good bet that it could become pretty socialist, it probably was Israel, right? Because of the dominance of socialist politics in the country. All the major parties in early years of Israeli politics were socialist in one way or the other. They were not pro-Soviet, but they were socialist, although many of them were also pretty pro-Soviet. And the Tudeh party at the time, both through its own organs and through what is called the sort of Society of Cultural and Social Society of Iranian Jews, which publishes a well-known paper called Bani Adam, asks the Iranian government to establish relations with Israel. So it does two things: ask Iran to establish relations with Israel, and it asks Israel to break with the West and become an anti-colonial third worldist nation, if you're to use the readings of today. And you can see, I'll just read one quote from November 1951. This is the reading it has on 1947-1948 war. It says, the Arab nations, without any benefit to themselves, were provoked against the Jewish nation. Innocent people killed each other in vain. The Arab and Jew, who had a common enemy, started fighting each other to death due to the conspiracies and deceptions of that very enemy. At the end, however, the British government failed in bringing about its colonial plot and had to concede defeat by the will of the heroic people of Israel. So, the communist line on this is a bit naive, right? It says, if Arabs and Jews are fighting in Palestine, this is not, they naturally love each other and would be great with each other. It's the foreign plots of Britain and colonials who sets them against each other. But this also means that they are, as you see, they're pretty positive toward Israel. And I have many interesting quotes here, which I'll try to, I don't really have time for. They denounce the Mufti, who keeps popping up in the Iranian press. They denounce his anti-Semitism, and denounce it in a very fascinating way, by the way. It's not just liberal rights of Iranian Jews. They try to explain why many Jews around the world fight imperialism, and, the Mufti worked with Hitler, so you're not serious. In 1952, we see that Bani Adam, for example, says, "We congratulate the Israeli nation on the anniversary of Israeli independence. On behalf of the Iranian Jewish community, we congratulate the conscious nation of Israel and salute the spirit of martyrs and freedom lovers who lost their lives in this path. We hope that the Israeli nation is able to achieve greater success and victory as its fruitful struggles go on. We once more ask the Iranian government to establish political and commercial ties with the state of Israel, stop its insistence on separation from and lack of relations with the Israeli nation. It should stop pursuing this path, which is contrary to the real interests of the Iranian nation." Okay? And there are other sides to the Iranian politics. There are many early enthusiasts of Israeli freedom. General Razmarov, this important political military figure, it speaks in the Officers Club, says Israeli army should sort of be a model for Iran. Iran has a role in the Iraqi Aliyah. As I mentioned before, Nasrallah, that's the Nasrallah Intizam, not the more contemporary guy. He's obviously at the UN. I spoke about his role. He gets to talk a lot with Abu Aban, his Israeli counterpart. They meet regularly. Iran doesn't. Iran votes against the admission of Israel to the United Nations, as I said. But they have a relationship, so they still talk. And in September 1949, Turkey breaks ground by recognizing Israel. No one wants to be the first. Turkey is now the first Muslim nation, so it makes it easier for Iran to do so. And there is a U.S. role. As Shah has a very interesting trip. About 2 months he stays in the U.S. in late 1949, and Truman tells him, "Look, we want everybody to get along in the Middle East, so it would be great if you can do what Turkey has done, and just have relations with Israel." So in the in March 1950, under Prime Minister Said Maraghi, Iran gives de jure recognition to Israel. Reza Safinian, it's sort of dispatched to Israel. Entezam meets up in UN with Abu Aban and tells him this recognition. Abu Aban is very happy. He says, we're going to have great relations. We're going to be great friends. So there's sort of a very interesting transcripts at the time. In this, March 1950, Safinian holds a reception in Jerusalem, to which everyone sort of shows up. So again, for me, it's interesting how this details gets lost in history, because sometimes when they say de jure recognition, the idea is that it was sort of it was sort of given semi-secretly or something, but actually, Safinian is pretty open about it. Mossadegh, the nationalist prime minister, comes to power in 1951, and the day of debating Iranian politics sort of has opened up in this period, which is that obviously Israel has gone to war in 47, 48. It has a pretty belligerent sort of position towards its Arab neighbors, and vice versa. In 1956, of course, it will team up with Britain and France to attack the Nasserist Egypt. But even before Egypt was with Nasser, there are those in Iran who believe Iran should side with the Arabs, and they see Arabs as the nascent. They've sort of given up hope on Israel becoming anti-colonial in any sense, especially since Israel, joins the U.S. in the Korean War. So there's a new pro-Arab and anti-Israel sentiment in Iranian politics at the time. In summer of 1951, Iran closes its consulate in Jerusalem, and Safinian, the first Iranian envoy to Israel, comes home. It's very interesting because Mossadegh at the time actually, this is not a very belligerent anti-Israel move. Mossadegh says it was for financial reasons, and he asked Switzerland to continue defending Iranian interests in Israel, right? Iran doesn't have a representative there. It's not like today. But there's a very big debate in Iran, around 7 or 8 of July 1951. Everyone, Qavam, other people talk about Israel. But the economic ties between the countries are not cut. Iran continues selling agriculture. It gets industrial goods from Israel. The Jewish Agency Office in Iran, very interesting. In April 1953, Fatemi, who is this nationalist foreign minister of Iran, who later gets executed after 53 coup. In April 1953, he closes the Jewish agency offices. He is clearly developing ties with Nasser, who's come to power in Egypt in 1952. But the Jewish Agency office opens like a month later. So there's a huge internal struggle over this. Iran and Israel sign a commercial treaty. And you know what's the best source for following all of this? Not just Iranian newspaper, but the American Jewish newspapers. They really care about this. They follow this day to day. Like Jewish Agency office came, Jewish Agency office went. And the Bank Melli Iran, the National Bank of Iran, opens sort of signs a very important contract with Bank Leumi in Israel in June 1953 with Mossadegh in power. So again, these basic historiographies in which Mossadegh is anti-Israel don't contend with this fact. Um, the you know looks like by the time we're not going to get as much 2079 I wanted, but I think it's good. We get a sort of a thicker description of these years than we would have otherwise. But post 1953, this is a problem with having an hour. I thought an hour is infinite, so I put too much in here. And post 1953, obviously there's a coup in 1953 in Iran. The Shah will have total power. The period of Iranian democracy ends. Our heroic nationalist prime minister Mohammad Mossadegh is put to house arrest. And in this period, Iran starts developing a closer tie with Israel. And this is a fascinating period. The football teams within the countries, go and come. My favorite club, Esteghlal, beats Hapoel FC at some point in the final of the Asian League. There's Iranian students in Israel. There's agricultural students. Folks of Fuse Kashani Sabet have also done really sort of great work about people-to-people ties in this period. But what is the actual position of the Shah? Let me spend my remaining minutes to talk about this again to clear some confusions here. You see, the position of the Shah is not that, oh, the United States told us, we have to be pro-Israel and that's why we're pro-Israel. Again, the position of the Shah is very much from Iranian national interest. Shah is always very clear that Iran does care for the Palestinian issue, that it does care for Palestinian Arabs, that it has sympathies for them, but that it also has de facto, by this point, relations with Israel. It never elevates them to official diplomatic relations for good reason. And he tells very clearly to Israelis, he says, look, you end the occupation after 1967, you end the occupation of Palestinian territories, we'll have open relations with you. Not unlike what MBS is saying today. But we're not going to do it before. But at the same time, tells Palestinians, says, look, you guys are crazy. You can't want to destroy Israel. This goal will go nowhere. So Iran very much sees itself as above the fray in this conflict, if you will, and tries to have relationship on both sides. And Shah actually asks LBJ to mediate between Israelis and Palestinians. And then, he sort of gets told off. And they don't tell him seriously. He also wants to mediate in the Vietnam War, but that's a different topic. So it's a very, I have wealth of material on this period. Shah's relationship to different Arab powers. But let me just say that in 1967, after the Six-Day War, after Israel is clear that Israel sort of has won the war and takes over part of the West Bank, which was part of Jordanian territory. Iran sees itself very close to Jordan, and Gaza Strip, which was administered by Egypt before. Shah speaks very clearly against this. He's in a European trip, sort of gets up early in the morning, they give him the news, he follows it, and in his first media interview, he says this sentence that will be repeated by Iran throughout the next period. He says, the age of taking other people's territory with the force of arm has ended. عصر تصرف اراضی دیگران از طریق نیروی اسلحه پایان یافته. And they love, Ardash Rizadi, later Iran's prime minister, loves to quote this. Every time he talks to Arabs, he says, look, His Majesty said this already. And Iran, Nasser's Egypt had cut ties with Iran because of its relations with Israel, of course, but Iran reestablishes relations with Egypt. Again, unlike what some people think, this doesn't happen after Nasser is dead. Nasser is very much alive. He just happens to die a few weeks later after established relations with Iran by a heart attack. Why is this important? Because it's not like Iran waited for Nasser to die and Sadat to come and then establish relations with Sadat. That would make more sense, and sort of it seems commonsensical, so some books make this mistake. It's a mistake. The Iran establishment relations, if you can read books by Rohala Ramazani and stuff, we'll go into detail of this. This already happens in 1970. 1970, right before Nasser has died. Shah has very important relations with Arab countries in this period. This also means that, of course, the Palestinian sort of transnational politics that often opposes Arab countries, sort of leaderships. Um, this is the sort of thing that Shah and Arab leaders like to sort of talk about together. It's also very interesting. If you look at Arash Zahedi, Iranian foreign minister, some interesting quote for you. He has a very interesting meeting with George Brown in January 1970, George Brown being the British foreign minister, in which Zahedi says, look, we believe Israel should evacuate the occupied territories. And Israel should not think they will have a direct negotiation with the Arabs before they do this. They also analyze Israeli politics together. It says there's the Moshe Dayan and there is Golda Meir and there's the youth. The youth are going to be the future of Israeli politics. It's very interesting. And George Brown keeps saying, look, my wife is Jewish, but I'm neutral in this. And, which is a sort of interesting part. So Iran and Britain are really looking at this together in sort of almost the same page. And in Iran, as I said, let me just give you a very interesting meeting in December 1970 in Zahedi's beautiful villa outside Tehran, Hesarak. Abba Aban, now Israel's foreign minister and a very respected global diplomat, is in Iran, as is Meir Ezri, who a lot of you would know. It's a great Iranian Studies Center, a few kilometers north of you, named after him. They're in Iran in December 1970, in which Zahedi again repeats the Iranian position. Says, look, we have no problems with Israel. We like Israel. We welcome you. But our relations are only going to be official if you end the occupation of the Palestinian territories. And they have, very fascinating, the transcript of this, it's very quite fascinating. You see there's a camaraderie on both sides, but they also saw disagreements or issues. And Zahedi tells Abu Aban, for example, that you really should appreciate more King Hussein of Jordan. This guy is important for regional stability. You guys are gonna get him overthrown, and you're gonna regret you did it. So very much my point is that Iran's look in the region is very much also um, out of the consideration it has for its Arab allies. Now, on the Iranian opposition, in the remaining minutes that I have, I'll point out the Iranian opposition. Obviously, there is a very different type of Israel debate going on. Khomeini picks up the mantle of the Kashani, of an old sort of classic. He doesn't use quite the same classic anti-Semitic sort of language all the time, but it is there if you look for it. Of course, for example, there's this conspiracy that the Zionists burnt down Masjid al-Aqsa in 1969. As you know, he was like a crazy Australian tourist. But this is what leads to the foundation of the Organization of Islamic Countries, which is very interesting. But Khomeini at the time, keeps saying, these are the people who burned the Qurans in Masjid al-Aqsa, and Shah has relation with them. And Shah's relations with Israel become really much bigger in Khomeini's attacks. For example, the 1971 celebrations in Iran, he says this is the anti-Islamic fist. This is a direct Khomeini quote. Anti-Islamic fist, which is being organized under the supervision of Israeli engineers and experts. My good friend Robert Steele has a beautiful book on this celebrations 1971. It's not clear that Israeli experts had any role or definitely some sort of an outsized role. But at the same time, there's of course a global movement against Israel that will have its Iranian counterparts. And I don't have much time to go to the details of this, but there's a sort of a unfortunate gathering of different sides. Soviet Union often ends up flirting with anti-Semitism. Dmitry Yassinovsky is one of the people who's written and works on this topic, in detail. This finds its echoes in Iran. The Iranian New Left also starts adopting its own different sorts of and there are different shades of anti-Israeli opposition. Obviously, not all of it is anti-Semitic. Some of it is. But there's obviously different forms of anti-Israeli opposition. But let me just end it here. Let me end it with a debate that I like, and I sort of go into detail about it in my dissertation, which really shows you again some flavors of Iranian political debates on Israel. In 1972, a young Iranian leftist wants to translate a pamphlet by Matzpen, the Israeli far left organization, to Persian. So this is published in New Left Review in February 1971 under the title of Class Nature of Israeli Society. It's Haim Hanegbi, Moshe Machover, and Akiva Or. Which is a pretty sort of anti-Zionist statement, if you will. And he wants to translate this to Persian, and he does, and it gets published. The problem is it gets published by a publication house run by Bagher Momeni, who was an old Tudeh member, jailed during the 53 coup. He's sort of come out of prison in 1958. He's an old lefty. Um, and he has an old classic communist line on Israel Palestine, which is not going to be like this new left line, which is very much sort of for destruction of Israel in sympathy with the armed groups against Israel. So they start having a funny debate in the different publications of this book. This is officially published in Iran under the Shah's regime, so the debate has, can't be very open. It's very interesting. For example, they never mention the name Lenin. They just say Ulyanov, which is his birth name. There are things you couldn't say. But they have so the publication of this book come out and they have like three different introductions. So Momeni gives an answer, then Keshkar gives an answer, and what is this debate about? In this debate, Momeni supports the Israeli communists, and he says, this just shouting slogans against Zionism is not going to change anything in Israel. Um, for example, he says, Momeni writes, this is Bagher Momeni, the old leftist. He says the anti-Zionist slogan might have some attraction for the masses of the Arab nation, but it has no such motivation to the Jewish masses. The foundation of Zionism would instead rumble if its tactics, warmongering, and military dictatorship are fought against. I mean, it's the foundation of Zionism. He really means the sort of Israeli government and what they consider to be a warmonger or militarist policy that at the time was under the question. There is no question of, Israeli Jews don't have a right to be there, or the Israeli state doesn't have a right to exist. I mean, that for Momeni. And he will say raising the flag of a struggling against Zionism will mean different things to different sectors of society. It's a sectarian method which leads to political isolation. He supports, Meir Wilner, the Israeli communist. And he says, we need the slogans of peace that can unite Arabs and Jews inside and outside the borders of Israel against the government in Tel Aviv. Whereas Keshkar, the sort of new leftist, compares Israel to Nazi Germany or South Africa, and he says Israel was created by imperialist conspiracies and backing of global reactionary circles. It can never be compared to newly independent countries. The nature of Zionism is reactionary and fascist. It's the enemy of all dynamic forces. It's used to oppress peoples and serve colonialism. So you will see a very two different takes on Israel in the Iranian left that are happening right in 1970s before leading to 1979 revolution. So I want to end it here. Obviously, the 1979 revolution and changes in Iranian politics, Iranian policy is a different question. I hope I didn't sort of confuse you with all this marching through decades of history, but let me just end it like this. What should be very clear is, first of all, sort of conclusions, if you will, for the leadership of the Iranian state, for the Iranian statesmen, um, they are always looking at Israel as from the perspective of Iranian national interest. It's a country in the region that they want to have relations with, commercial relations with, people-to-people relations with. You never have the sort of Israel shouldn't exist, or Israelis don't deserve to be there, or you don't never have this official state policy before 1979, and frankly, it's not part of respectable political debate either. And in the Iranian opposition, I tried to show in the Iranian left, right? There was this history of the Iranian communism having actually asked for Iran to establish relations with Israel. And the years leading to 79, you're gonna have, a big debate about this, and the contours change. But nevertheless, there is a debate, i.e., the anti-Israel position is seriously contested in this way by old leftists like Bagher Momeni. Not too many. We're not talking about liberals or other parts of the spectrum, right? And that do oppose this anti-Israel orientation of huge parts of the left. And of course, in 1979, this is going to be to shift, but Iran never ceases to be Iran, and those who believe that Israel and Iran should have relationships, and this is in line with Iranian national interests. They don't go away or simply disappear. They're there. The Iranians. They'll continue to be there, and it will mean that the Israel debate in Iranian politics is always going to be different than those in Arab countries and others, and it should be organized and understood. It should be understood and studied on its own terms.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I think a lot of us really appreciate the nuanced picture that you've presented. Although I don't see any questions in the Q&A function, I'm sure that there are. So if anyone has a question and would like to, use the function to raise their hand, um, that would be wonderful. I'm not seeing any just yet. So I will start with the first question. And I mean, it's pretty simple. I'm just wondering how contemporary Iranian historians or historians and scholars inside Iran today, how they relate to this, let's say the 1930s to 1950s period and debate that you depicted for us and how they relate to the sort of neutrality that you discussed.
It's fascinating. So inside Iran, there are those who are, they there are those who have sort of adopted an anti-Israel version. And this it's very interesting. It can go in different ways. They can sometimes claim that, oh, Iran was always anti-Israel, even under the Shah it was anti-Israel. The way they do that, I mean, this is the problem with this field, right? What does anti-Israel or anti-Zionist mean can mean very different things, right? So if you say whoever criticizes Israel at some point is anti-Israel, then you can pick up these quotations and say, they are. And there are also those who, like myself, who am a contemporary Iranian historian, just not in Iran. No, but no, jokes aside, I mean, there are those who basically make this argument that, oh, well, Iran used to prioritize its national interests and had relations with Israel from that perspective. And there are also others who basically sort of take a certain point of pride in this as because they basically see how Iran was pretty enlightened. And frankly, there's another way of looking at it is that Iran was kind of years ahead in some ways of its Arab neighbors. Because with the Shah and them, he's saying to all these Arab leaders that he meets at different points, he says, look, Israel is going to be there, and in 30, 40 years, you're going to recognize it. I mean, this is literally at something that Zahedi, Iran's prime minister, and Shah say at different points. They to a few different Arab leaders. They said, look, in 30, 40 years, you're going to have to recognize Israel. So why not get ahead of it and think about it now? So I would say the historiography in Iran, includes sort of very, there's like pseudo historiography, pro-regime versions that is like, oh, the Zionists made Shah do this or that. But the more sort of respectable one includes both, as I said, sort of those who claim an anti-Israel continuity, and those who point out to sort of Iran's national, the centrality of Iran's national interest. But take this opportunity to also remind everyone that there's actually a very fascinating a study of Iran and Israel in Iran that is often gets forgotten. There are Israeli studies journals and all that, and you read this stuff. It's not the propaganda pushed by some regime outlets. It's very sort of serious scholarship, and it would be better for everybody to sort of consult them.
Thank you. Mayor, you want to unmute yourself? Mayor, you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very, very much for this fascinating talk. Personally, I've learned a lot. Let me also say that I've taken seriously your very early comment that you would wish to come to Israel. I'm taking it as a rain check, that you will, you will have our invitation is open.
That's very
kind. I have a short comment and a question. Short comment about the point you mentioned, the very interesting debate within the Iranian left. The two-day, in my view, adopted the Soviet position, which Zionism is negative because there is no international Jewish people. However, once the Jews established a viable community in mandatory Palestine, later Israel, this community deserves to survive. And the Soviets and then other communists accepted the idea, what they call the Israeli people, which is different from the Jewish people. And this, what you discussed, what you mentioned, in my view, is so part of this broader position, the communist position that Soviet Union in a way decided, and other communist parties. So, by the way, also Arab communist parties followed the same position after 1948. This is the comment. The question is, could you elaborate a little bit more on? There's an argument that there was a shift in Iranian, you can say, public discourse, culture after in 1963, or you can say basically before that with Ali Ahmed, the publication of Gharb Zedegi, that discourse becomes increasingly anti-Western, and then Israel is very much associated, even not by people from the far left, but from the far left, but others, much more with the West, the imperialist West, and then there's a growing anti-Israeli tendency. What do you think about this argument? Finally, one short comment. There were two, football/soccer games between Israel and Iran, 1968, 1972, and there the public or the spectators were extremely hostile. Now, it's difficult to say how much was it simply, football fans who want their team to win, whatever the cost, or if it had any ideological element. But again, thank you very, very much for this very, very fascinating talk.
So I answer one by one.
You know what? Why don't you answer Mayor and then we'll collect the last questions and you can do it that way.
For sure. Yeah. So thank you so much. First of all, for the invitation. I really would love to come, and I hope that's sort of possible soon. And so on the couple of points that you raised. So first of all, the Iranian Arab Communist parties, it is true. Although I would say that it's not that they just adopt the Soviet position, and that the communist movement sort of comes to a position the Soviet Union also adopts at some point. As I tried to show, for example, 2 days already in publishing stuff in favor of a Jewish state in April 1947. And that, yes, you are absolutely right about the broad Marxist umbrella is exactly as you described it. But there are important shifts both between the parties and in different years. The Iranian Communist Party, for example, is going to be unique after 48, 49, 50 by having a lot of Jewish members, a lot of whom who travel to Israel, right? So the kind of and the language it uses is always going to be different. Like as I said, there was a debate between different Iraqi and Iranian communists on the issue. And interestingly enough, Iranian Jewish communists, also keep sort of addressing the Israeli Jews as like our fellow Jews, and they go out of their way to say Zionism is not for us. Part of anti-Zionism, by the way, at this point is that they're saying, as Iranian Jewish communists, we're not asking Iranian Jews to leave Iran, and actually their struggle here for our rights really matters and all that. So, which they want to clarify that, but very much they want to sort of have a positive relations with Israel. And yeah, as I said, there are different shifts in this period. As I said, there's Soviet official anti-Semitism at some point, and also in 1979, of course, the leadership of the Tudeh Party of Iran also changes with the push from the Soviet Union, and the new leadership is going to support Ayatollah Khomeini and obviously have very different positions on Israel as well. On the post 1963, that's absolutely fascinating. I would say that the debate never goes away. It is true that a new opposition to Israel, because it is seen as a Western country, continues sort of to be there. I had some actual stuff about that in my talk, but I had to, give it up when it was like 40 minutes into, and I realized I'm still like in 1950s, which is also what happens to me whenever I'm teaching this conflict in class. I think it happens to a lot of people. But what is very fascinating is that, for example, when the 1967 war happened, so I said the Shah's reaction, but what is the intellectual circle's reaction? There's a very interesting debate with the two biggest giants of Iranian intellectual thought, Dariush Ashuri, who's basically pro-Israel. He sort of sees Israel like a lot of lefts around the world did at the time. He says, look, this is a state for the Jews, and it also has Jewish socialism. It's seen as, it's a country of the kibbutzim. So very much in 1967, he's still seeing it that way. Khalil Maleki, who was a leader of this Iranian Democratic Socialist, sees it in this way. And Ali Shariati, who obviously is a sort of devotee of Frantz Fanon, who never himself said anything about Palestine and Israel, interestingly enough. But nevertheless, Shariati, in very predictable and frankly a little sort of elementary language, sort of opposes Israel. So it is true that there's a new a new reaction to Israel as an anti-Western country, but the debate never entirely goes away. And on the Iranian football stuff, it's actually part of the same thing. So not just the spectators, which some of them do pretty nasty things as well. They're those sort of give Heil Hitlers, and they do sort of crazy football fans, far right football fan things. But the Iranian press at the time, runs a pretty negative review of Israelis, if you will. There's a Tawfiq, which is a very well-known Iranian cartoon journal, for example, publishes a sort of a cartoon in which he says, says funny things like, "Oh, Israelis, how are you are they going to leave the field after the 90-minute finishes, or are they going to occupy it, or they run this sort of thing. So there's definitely an anti-Israeli sentiment that is going around as part of a global anti-Western and also particular anti-Israeli thing. But the debate never goes away. This is always a subject of debate to Iranian politics. It's not unanimous. As I tried to show also, again, Ashuri and Maliki, these are not like some pro-courtiers who are like selling arms to Israel or something, right? I mean, these are like leftist intellectuals also, but they continue to sort of to have a, for a lack of a better, a pro-Israel position, certainly critical of the anti-Israelism of Shariati and others.
Joel, you want to go ahead? You need to unmute yourself first.
Yeah, thanks.
There you
Okay.
go.
Hi, thanks for coming on this Zoom. Arash, quickly, I'll just say I have a question I'm curious about if you know of Iranian intellectuals who reacted perhaps negatively or at all to Edward Said's Orientalism. I was reading some Indian Marxist scholars at the time in the 70s were kind of not necessarily didn't think he was wrong, but they were annoyed a little bit that he was turning away from the Marxist paradigm too much towards the post-structuralist kind of intellectual, the turn towards language and the emphasis on words and labels rather than kind of the hard nuts and bolts of, oppression and class struggle. And I wonder if in India that there was any echo of that kind of criticism.
Okay, thank you. Leora.
Hi, Ash. Hi, all. It's great to see you here. I really would like to ask about terminology. I know you mentioned it, and we had a sort of a discussion about it previously. Even here before the establishment of Israel, the Jerusalem Post, not a lot of people know, but it was called the Palestine Post. So terminology becomes very, very important. And I want to ask whether you encountered a very specific terminology when it comes to discussions about the Arab-Israeli conflict in Palestine, whether it is mandatory Palestine or Ottoman Palestine or Arab Palestine, the Zionist entity we are all familiar with. I mean, I'm very interested to know about the terminology and whether there are certain points in time when it changes. So this is just I know that it's not maybe something that we can resolve here and now, but I think it's of importance. And I just want like a very general remark that in 1939, when then the Crown Prince Mohammad Reza married Princess Fawzia of Egypt, in Jerusalem, they raised the flag in the embassy. So it was interested why it was important for the Iranian press to publish it that in Jerusalem they raised the flag in honor of that union. So that's just a remark. And thank you for your talk.
Thank you, Sam. So can I answer now? Yeah, so on Orientalism, so there are many Marxists around the world, Marxists especially in the Middle East, sort of rise up against Orientalism. The most important example is Sadiq al-Azam, of course, the Syrian Marxist who, writes a pretty scathing critique, and they was friends with Edward Said. They have some letters together. Both of them are pretty petty in the letters. It's kind of fun thing to read, and I think they never reconciled their friendship. But Iran basically, sorry, Orientalism came out in like 40. My apologies. Sorry, Orientalism came in 78, 79. Iranians basically had bigger fish to fry by that point, right? So it's wow, sorry. This is what happens when you talk for an hour, I guess. Yes, so Iranians have bigger fish to fry, right? We're leading to the revolution. They have a revolution. They're all gonna get killed soon, right? So Orientalism is not some sort of a big event in Iranian intellectual history as a book, right? But later on, of course, Edward Said is translated. Um, he's debated during the Khatami era. Mohajerani, Iran's culture minister, actually invites him to Iran, but he's very sick at that point, unfortunately, and he sort of passes away. And his books, both on Palestine and Orientalism, continue to be part of the question. But there could really be a paper on the fate of post-colonial studies in Iran. Because they're often very approvingly quoted by the regime press, of course, but then they have the Iranian leftists, so some of them have adopted it at some point, but yeah, so the initial Marxist rejection that you have, like in India or Sadiq Jalal it's not very prominent in Iranian press, and I really have seen the Iranian leftist press from at the time. They have bigger fish to fry with the revolution. As for the terms, Leora, thank you so much for this comment. I think it matters both how we are using the terms, right, in our scholarship, and how are we reflecting and understanding how the terms are used. So I would say before 47, 48, the term British man of Palestine is not really used, just the term Palestine or Palestine is used. It has a long pedigree sort of in Persian. And also the term Israel, which is written slightly differently in Persian, right? Is sort of means Jewish people, right, in Persian as well. So it's often used to say like Israel, right, with like Hamza, and to say like the folks of Israel, and they mean the Jewish people in Iran. Obviously, they had no clue that the state was going to be called Israel. But after Israel is established, so the term Israel is used very widely in Iranian press. There's not sort of a particular opposition to it. But of course, there's always, and this remains the case. It's not clear when people say Palestine, like do they actually continue to refer to Israel by that? And it's also, I would say, if you want interesting things about sort of terminology, it's very interesting what you mean by occupy. Of course, some people would refer to the sort of entirety as occupied, but also they use the Islamic term qasbi, right? So qasbi is something, we have Professor Kant here who can go into detail of Islamic terminology of what it really means. But qasbi basically means it's sort of inappropriately acquired, right? And so it's not occupied from an international law point. It's a Muslim land who was usurped by non-Muslims, right? Usurped, I think, is a good translation. I mean, that tells you a lot about someone's political stance if they use the term like qasbi or not. And the point about Jerusalem in 1939 and the flags is very fascinating, and it's again a good reminder. I mean, I did mention that Iran has a relationship with the Zionists throughout the Second World War. It's a very important reminder, and I can expand on this on my work. Unlike many Arab countries, unlike many sort of other places, Iran never has this sort of automatic rejection of the Zionist project or Jews in Palestine, and there are some sort of relations with it. And if you look at a consulate in Jerusalem, it has businessman-like relations, basically, with the British authorities, but also with the Jewish authority, like the Zionist political department organization. So they have, by businessman, I mean, okay, Iranians, there are a lot of merchants, right? And Iran sees itself as this big state in the region. So this is one of the reasons why it's never gonna be anti-Israel in before 1979 in a way that a lot of other Arab states are, because there's a history of Iran has a history of dealing with the sort of Yishuv. And yeah, and it's always gonna make it different. As I said, there are those who are very sort of enthusiastic Cyrusist, as I said, proponents. There are those who are a bit critical. There's also different, what is very fascinating is that, you can have people who are a little anti-Semitic, but also they are the ones who have a lot of relationships there, right? So, they're all about, Jews, this and that, but then they are the ones who are trading or selling, all right? So I think it's very important to understand, what we mean, what are sort of the consequences of political discourse at a time. So it doesn't mean that they were very nice always, or they believed in some sort of a friendship forever, but they definitely were in favor of relations. And it's also, again, important to remember that um, uh, from an Iranian geopolitical, standpoint, and from a sort of Iranian national interest standpoint, let's say if there's a triangle of Iran, Arabs, and Israel, um, Iran has, as traditionally has as many reasons to be anti-Arab, quote unquote, right? So a lot of times Iranians see Israelis as sort of opponents of their traditional opponents in some ways, right? And not everybody, right? As I said, but you know, that's one light in which this discussion is done.
Okay. Not Okay, I think that concludes the open questions that we have. The event was recorded and is going to be uploaded to our social media, so everyone's invited to take a look there and follow, and anyone who missed it can receive it there. And with that, I want to thank you again for joining us and providing us with such interesting perspective on this important piece of history. I hope that everyone will join us for our next session in about a month or so. And so keep your eyes peeled for another invitation. And once again, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for
Yeah,
having me. Thank you.
wonderful. Okay, we'll be in touch. Thank you. Bye.